We are well and truly into the 9th generation of Pokémon. Scarlet and Violet first came out over 2.5 years ago and just received a pretty impressive port to Switch 2. Legends ZA will be the 2nd Generation 9 game coming out on both consoles in just under 4 months, so we obviously haven't had a chance to play that just yet. I'm sure we'll find out more in July's Pokémon Presents, but so far at least, we have seen a fair few trailers and had a chance to look at the core gameplay. After ZA, we'll be turning our attention to Gen 10, which, if all lines up as we expect, should be announced and released in 2026, the 30th anniversary year for Pokémon. So in today's video, we're going to take a reflective look at the main Generation 9 games, what went right, what went wrong, and ultimately how Generation 10 needs to evolve the Pokémon games overall. Subscribe for more Pokémon deep dives, theories, and live streams. Only 3% of you are subscribed, so supporting the channel goes a long way, and together we can maybe even form an army of level 100 Weepinbells. Okay, so let's get into it. Now, if I had been making this video just 1 month ago, we'd have far more to complain about, and that's because Generation 9 got off to a rocky start, with Scarlet and Violet's poor functionality on the Switch 1. Glitchiness, jagged looks, input lag, and aliasing issues meant overall the games just felt bad to play. They were simply unfinished and came out before they were ready. But luckily for us, the Switch 2's free update massively improved these aspects of the game. You still run into a glitch from time to time, it's a little rough around the edges still, and I think that's primarily due to bad, rushed core development more than anything. The grass still looks like a PS1 texture, but the power the Switch 2 offers makes me think that Scarvy was probably always destined for the Switch 2 system. Playing it on each of the two consoles is night and day. However, we still have to dock some major points off Generation 9, as the Switch 1 version was the only way to play this officially for 2.5 years. When Gen 9 is finished, that's going to be like 70% of its total life cycle. So whether that's Nintendo's fault, Game Freak's fault, or the Pokémon Company International's fault, the end result was that us fans were stuck with a poorly functioning game for way too long. The good news is, we probably won't have to worry about that for Gen 10. Gen 10 will almost definitely be totally designed and optimized for the Switch 2. I don't even think it's guaranteed to come out on the Switch 1 at all, but you can still design a game badly regardless of console power, and that is the case in a lot of parts of Scarvy, even on the Switch 2. There's a certain unwillingness or lack of ambition in some areas compared to other games, and that has really been felt in recent years. In Gen 10, I don't want to see enemies running into walls, phasing in and out of walls, being stuck inside walls, a lot of wall-themed issues here, but Gen 10 just needs significantly more finesse and polish. So let's specifically zone into these issues and how Gen 10 can fix them. One major issue in Gen 9 is the uninteresting environments. Scarvy is based on Spain and Portugal, and to be fair, they did a decent job capturing the vibe of the Iberian towns. But even in these towns, it nearly always feels like a place to just walk through, and there's not much to interact with. You can't go into most buildings. Everything you actually need, like the Pokemon centers or NPCs who you can actually talk to, are all outside, and that results in this feeling that you're simply walking through a kind of hologram. And when you're in the more wild parts, journeying between the cities, there's the occasional ruin or tower, meaning you get some isolated moments that are visually interesting, but most of the game is a fairly empty, copy and paste environment, made far worse by the low resolution assets and textures. Vast expanses of grass, water, mountain, or woodland with a severe lack of life or definition other than Pokemon kind of aimlessly walking around for the most part. In mainland Paldea, 90% of your journey will just be running through an underwhelming environment, probably also getting frustrated at how often you accidentally run into small wild Pokemon and trigger a battle because you didn't realize they were there. And this is not at all helped by the weird lighting system in the game. A lighting system which affects the way colors appear, that changes very suddenly and has loads of weird shadow issues. And you'll probably miss a bunch of shinies due to that poor lighting. And the fact that for some reason, shiny Pokemon don't sparkle and make a sound anymore like they did in Legends Arceus, the game that came out before this one. The whole thing just looks way too much like a web browser game in a lot of areas. Legends EA might possibly take care of these problems, and the very fact it's supposedly contained to one single city but in the same engine as Scarvy means they seem to be focusing on getting the map right and making a more engaging, contained and functional environment rather than making it feel bloated and empty. However, I can't say the art direction blows my socks off. And again, even the city textures feel flat, low res, and undefined from what we've seen, which is not a great sign when you've consciously decided to do away with entire regions and zone into a smaller, single city environment as your entire game's map. Plus, the lighting and shadows from the trailers only look marginally improved compared to Scarvy, and inconsistent in places. There are so many cities that look better than this in other, often much older games, but I don't want to get too carried away before I've actually played Legends EA. It deserves a fair shot before we start forming opinions. But what can Generation 10 learn from this? Well, basically, it needs to do the opposite of everything I just described. We need more things to interact with. Back in the handheld days, you could just get lost in the world, exploring abandoned power plants, sophisticated cave systems, maybe in the middle of the ocean, abandoned mansions and shipwrecks, none of which were necessary to complete the game, but all of which were usually worth exploring, either for side quests, Easter eggs, or rare Pokémon. That level of immersion is just not there at the moment. So Gen 10 needs to have an intelligent, refined map design that constantly tests you with interesting distractions as you explore the world. I think Scarvy and its DLC did a slightly better job than Sword and Shield with that. Sword and Shield's base game felt very linear outside of the wild area, but the bar was pretty low, and in Scarvy, they barely raised it. So Gen 10 needs to take advantage of the hardware and seriously design a proper RPG world full of life and possibilities. And one way to do this is through the Pokémon themselves. Now, I understand with Pokémon, there are a lot of unique characters to design, even with the national dex being no more. Each Pokémon needs to behave, move, fight, and play with a unique personality. That's a lot to build. And you know what? I think they did an okay job in Gen 9. They added more than we've seen before. You will see Pokémon like Tentacle submerging themselves deep underwater, Kilowattrel soaring above the waves, Greavard hiding underground. Some Pokémon will sleep by trees or run away if you get too close, and I've even seen the sworn enemies Zangoose and Seviper having standoffs and fighting with each other. Others will see you as a challenge and show a level of aggression, initiating battles with you unless you dodge them. Others are more curious and passive. But with all that being said, we're now moving into the late 2020s, and on the Switch 2, I think Game Freak are capable of a lot more. So what's the next step? Well, maybe each Pokémon could have its own personality based on its actual nature, not just a copy and pasted default for each Pokémon species. So a bold or serious natured Rattata might challenge you, even if it sees you running around with a massive Charizard, whereas a lax one might ignore you and be less aggressive, and maybe a quirky one does something playful like a little funny pose as you walk by. I'd also like to see the Pokémon interact with each other more, to create a real feel that there's a live ecosystem at play. In any RPG, that's a huge win. It just makes the world feel more alive. You do occasionally see toned down versions of this in Scarvy, like multiple Pokémon surrounding other Pokémon, but that's kind of all that happens. It doesn't really go anywhere from there. And so, emphasizing and diversifying Pokémon personalities across the entire map would be so much more immersive. Plus, I very much hope that the Synchro Machine was a beta test for being able to control Pokémon in a more interesting way in Gen 10. Each Pokémon could have their own uses in the overworld. In old games, some Pokémon would dig and teleport, some could light up areas, smash or move rocks, climb waterfalls or surf, and I'd like to see a use for every single Pokémon in some regard, and even obstacles around the map that only a small select few Pokémon could handle. That would give us extra purpose when completing the Pokédex, because each Pokémon would have unique abilities, able to get you to secret places of the map. Maybe some psychic Pokémon could communicate with other Pokémon to calm them down in certain situations or help them. Fire Pokémon could walk on lava to retrieve hidden items. Ground Pokémon could open up a whole underground map, Donkey Kong Bonanza style. It would breathe so much life into the game, especially if you could couple that with a new Pokémon Snap level of environmental interaction from the wild Pokémon themselves. Maybe a group of Pokémon gang up on another Pokémon and a bigger Pokémon comes to save it, with an actual real-time battle ensuing that you're not involved with but can observe, and maybe even get involved with if you want to. Maybe wild Pokémon recreationally battle together to get tougher. Maybe they play together or even compete for resources. Maybe you see wild Pokemon evolve after battle before your eyes. It would also be cool to see damaged Pokemon getting healed by wild nurse Pokemon like Chansey, Ordino, and Alomomola, mostly to make us as the player feel less guilty when we're slaughtering everything on sight in auto battle mode. Of course, it would be a shame if a shiny Pokemon was involved in something like this and got knocked out, rendering it uncatchable, but I'm sure they could quite easily put some code in that exempts shiny Pokemon from disappearing or something similar. Dare I say, it would be cool to even see something like a Pidgeot take a Caterpie and fly away with it, for example, backing up some of the Pokédex entries that have talked about predator and prey relationships that exist within the universe. That might be a little too adult, but ZA just got the highest age rating a Pokemon game has ever got, and you don't necessarily have to see the Pokemon mauling each other apart. There is just so much further they can take it than what we currently have, especially when you look at some of the animations from games that are over 2 decades old, and see some of the situations that unfold in the new Pokemon Snap levels. Another massively important part of the overworld is of course the NPCs. To Gen 9's credit, I was actually so pleased that the trainers stopped becoming copy and pasted archetypes of the exact same trainer class. It really bothered me that every Team Yell or Macro Cosmos member looked the exact same, apart from being male or female. At least in Scarvy, each trainer actually feels like a unique person with their own style, height, weight and hair colour, and that was way overdue. But now, the NPCs need to evolve in their actual behaviour. No more aimlessly walking in lines and phasing in and out of existence. That was passable on the 3DS, but for this franchise, on this new console, I just feel that won't cut it. Way back in Gen 2, in 1999, you had 2 random trainers battling with each other above Cherry Grove, and you had to let them get on with it. And I know this was totally scripted as a progression obstacle, but it really sticks in my memory as one of those subtle moments that just immersed me in the world of Pokemon. So if they can take that and apply it to the modern 3D games with other trainers that exist within your journey, battling each other with different outcomes and maybe actually leveling up their Pokemon in real time, that would create a super unique experience for everybody's save file, rather than a scripted, formulaic experience that's the same for everyone. I think that's the reason why randomizers and ROM hacks give Pokemon games so much replayability, because different trainers can have different Pokemon and it's totally unpredictable, making it constantly exciting. Think of the brand new Mario Kart World free roam mode. Each playable character is constantly driving around the map doing different things, and you can change to control any one of them GTA 5 style. And I know it's far easier to program random driving than varied NPC Pokemon trainers doing different things like battling, moving around and exhibiting various different behaviors, but in the mid-2020s, a combination of emergent NPC behavior and NPCs having actual schedules is totally achievable. Elder Scrolls Oblivion has this, and that game came out 19 years ago. It looks like in ZA, trainers participating in the ZA Royale do patrol around a bit, but I do expect them to still be scripted trainers with scripted teams and probably contained to small areas. It's a step, but I think Game Freak need to take bigger leaps in Gen 10. To support this dynamic NPC idea, key characters like rivals and maybe even general NPC trainers as well could also have a wider team roster in their PC to choose from that they actually do change. Way back in Generation 1, your rival would speak about how many Pokemon he'd caught when you bumped into him on the SSN, but of course, his team would still be scripted. That doesn't have to be the case in 2025. And this would also help with the fact that you, as the player, feel overpowered in every game for no real reason. I do wonder why I can fill up like 20 boxes of Pokemon, but every trainer I bump into, at least the rival trainers who are meant to be strong, haven't even figured out how to train a team of 6 unless they're the Elite 4 or a gym leader, who canonically do cater their teams according to how strong of a trainer they think you are. The trainers could still have 1 or 2 scripted aces, but some level of machine learning from your last battle, or just a randomized dynamic selection of Pokemon based on what that trainer has caught, would really increase that level of immersion. It does become a little more complicated for double battles because combinations have to be specific if you have a real strategy, but I'm sure Game Freak could figure it out if they put their mind to it. On the topic of NPCs and other in-game characters, here's a big one: voice acting. This is a controversial debate because you can make arguments for it and against it. On the one hand, Pokemon spamming text boxes at us at the very least gives us that reading a book kind of feel, where you can use your imagination to create a personality and set a tone of voice that you like for any given character. Plus, it allows you to listen to the soundtracks a bit more closely. Then, Game Freak could leave it to other mediums like the Pokemon anime to actually give us real voices. However, we don't even have human sound effects like in Zelda and Mario, and even that would add a lot to the personality of the characters. Sometimes, especially in 3D games, the dead silences, accompanied by a few facial expression changes and nothing else besides the constant pushing A sound effect, feels a bit lackluster, especially considering the upscaling that's being attempted in other areas of the game. The sheer amount of information that comes through in text boxes perhaps doesn't translate as well on modern consoles as it did on handheld systems. Some people might have expected ZA to be the game that debuts voice acting, as the Legends series could be seen as a good place to trial it, considering it's a sub-series kind of designed to develop some of the classic Pokémon mechanics. However, it seems we're not getting it in ZA, and therefore at all in Gen 9, so Gen 10 could be the perfect place to try it out in some capacity. Voice acting would solve a lot of issues with story pacing, because the last few main series games have had 2-hour tutorial portions that can leave you extremely bored early on, and they are so long in large part because text boxes are the main way to give the player information and set the tone for the overall story. And I don't even think you necessarily need to do away with text boxes. They do allow the player to control the pace and make sure they've understood information, but games have been doing combinations of text boxes and voice acting for years, and it works really well in some of the best games to ever exist. And there are other ways to improve this character and story immersion as well, like more proper cinematics that don't contain annoying fades from black to save work in the development process. It is so underwhelming when you take a bunch of classes, trek the entire Paldea map, finding every single secret key to unlock the encounters with the Ruinous Quartet, and your reward for doing so, at that big moment when you first meet these mysterious Pokemon, is a quick rumble and smash sound effect, a fade to black, and then the Ruinous Pokemon suddenly appearing. You might expect this from an indie or low budget game, but for the main series of Pokemon games, I think this level of action is borderline embarrassing. These moments deserve full cinematics, and these cheap fillers have been an issue going back several generations. Now I must admit, Gen 9 evolved from Gen 8 mechanically in a lot of ways, as every Pokemon generation did compared to the one that came before it. But on the Switch, Pokemon delivered a total of 5 unique main series games, and though we haven't seen everything ZA has to offer, the progress across those 5 games has been far too slow and steady when you see what competitors and other AAA games are producing on the same console. It still feels like what we're seeing, in a lot of instances, could have been done on a PS2. So we'll leave it there for today, but let me know if you'd like to see a part 2 of this video, as I have more ideas that I'd love to share. I'd be really interested to hear how else you think Gen 10 can move the franchise on from Gen 9 in a meaningful way. So be sure to leave a comment, and until next time, love you gang.